The snow began falling on December 15, 1944, blanketing the Ardennes forest in a deceptive white silence that would soon be shattered. By the thunder of war, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard stood at the observation post, overlooking the Belgian countryside, watching German armor emerge from the forest like phantoms materializing from a nightmare. What he witnessed would become Hitler's last desperate gamble operation, Watch on the Rhine. Known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, the German offensive caught the Allied forces completely off guard. For months, intelligence reports had suggested the Wehrmacht was finished, its reserves depleted, its fighting spirit broken. General Omar Bradley had confidently declared the Ardennes sector a ghost front, manned by green American divisions recovering from previous battles. The 106th Infantry Division, fresh from training camps in America, had been positioned there precisely because military strategists believed nothing significant would happen in that quiet sector. But Adolf Hitler had other plans. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 16th, over 100,000 German troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, launched a massive assault across an 85-mile front. The German plan was audacious in its scope: punch through the Allied lines, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and split the British and American forces in two. If successful, it might force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to concentrate its remaining strength against the Soviet Union. The initial assault was devastating. The German 1st SS Panzer Army, led by the ruthless Sepp Dietrich, smashed through American positions with terrifying efficiency. The 5th Panzer Army, commanded by Hasso von Manteuffel, advanced rapidly toward the Meuse River. Villages that had known peace for months suddenly found themselves in the path of advancing panzers and elite SS troops. Among the chaos, one small Belgian town would emerge as the symbol of American resistance. Bastogne, a modest crossroads settlement of 4,000 inhabitants, sat at the convergence of 7 major roads. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the movement of men and supplies throughout the region. The German High Command understood this strategic reality, as did the American commanders who would soon make their stand there. As reports of the German breakthrough flooded into Allied headquarters, panic spread through the command structure. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, found himself facing his greatest crisis since D-Day. The carefully planned advance into Germany had suddenly become a desperate fight for survival. Emergency reinforcements were rushed to the front, but would they arrive in time? The weather conspired against the Americans. Heavy snow and thick fog grounded the Allied Air Force, negating one of their greatest advantages. German forces, many wearing white camouflage, moved like ghosts through the winter landscape. American units, caught completely unprepared for winter warfare, struggled to maintain their positions as temperatures plummeted below freezing. According to historical accounts referenced in Stephen Ambrose's Band of Brothers, the surprise was so complete that some American soldiers were captured while still in their sleeping bags. Entire units simply vanished in the first hours of the attack, overrun before they could mount effective resistance. The carefully constructed Allied front line, built up over months of steady advance, crumbled in a matter of hours. As darkness fell on December 16th, the magnitude of the German achievement became clear. They had opened a bulge in the Allied lines stretching nearly 50 miles wide and 20 miles deep. The question now was whether American resolve would prove stronger than German desperation. In the brutal winter battle that lay ahead, the morning of December 17th dawned gray and bitter, with temperatures dropping to 10 degrees below zero in the town of Bastogne. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe received urgent orders that would thrust him into the pages of history. His 101st Airborne Division, still recovering from their brutal fight in Holland during Operation Market Garden, was to move immediately to Belgium and hold the vital crossroads at all costs. McAuliffe's paratroopers, nicknamed the Screaming Eagles, had earned their reputation through blood and sacrifice. They had jumped into Normandy on D-Day, fought through the hedgerows of France, and survived the disaster at Arnhem. Now, loaded hastily onto trucks in the pre-dawn darkness, they raced toward what would become their greatest test. The journey to Bastogne revealed the full scope of the German breakthrough. Along the snow-covered roads, the paratroopers passed streams of retreating American soldiers, their faces marked by the shock of sudden defeat. Equipment littered the roadside abandoned, vehicles, scattered ammunition, and the debris of an army in retreat. The sight steeled the resolve of the airborne troops, who had never retreated from any battlefield. As the 101st Airborne approached Bastogne, they encountered Colonel Joseph Harper's 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, which had been fighting a desperate delaying action against advancing German forces. Harper's men, though outnumbered and outgunned, had managed to slow the enemy advance just enough to allow the paratroopers to reach the town before the Germans could surround it completely. The German forces converging on Bastogne represented some of the Wehrmacht's finest remaining units. The 2nd Panzer Division, veterans of campaigns from Poland to the Russian steppes, approached from the north. The Panzerlehr Division, an elite training unit pressed into combat service, moved up from the southeast. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, though composed largely of older reservists and young recruits, was led by experienced officers who understood the strategic importance of their objective. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, had been given explicit orders to capture Bastogne quickly and continue the advance toward the Meuse River. His tanks were already behind schedule, and every hour of delay gave the Americans more time to organize their defenses. The German timetable, ambitious from the beginning, now faced its first serious challenge. Inside Bastogne, McAuliffe quickly established his command post in the basement of the Heinz Barracks, a Belgian army facility on the outskirts of town. The building, constructed of thick stone walls, provided protection from artillery fire while allowing communication with his scattered battalions. Maps covered every available surface, marked with red arrows showing German advances and blue lines indicating American positions. The town itself presented both advantages and challenges for its defenders. The buildings provided cover and concealment, but the narrow streets could easily be blocked by rubble from artillery strikes. The civilian population, caught between the opposing forces, had largely fled to their cellars, leaving the streets eerily quiet except for the rumble of military vehicles and the distant sound of gunfire. As December 18th dawned, the German noose began to tighten around Bastogne. Roadblocks appeared on all major highways leading into the town. Radio communications with higher headquarters became sporadic, then ceased entirely. The 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division and various support units, found themselves completely surrounded. The psychological impact of encirclement affected different soldiers in different ways. Some felt trapped and desperate, while others found strength in the knowledge that they were all that stood between the German army and its objectives. As referenced in historical accounts from the National Archives, many soldiers later recalled feeling a strange sense of relief once the encirclement was complete. Now they knew exactly where the enemy was, everywhere. McAuliffe, understanding the critical nature of his position, sent his last message to Corps headquarters before the communication lines were cut. "We are holding Bastogne." Those 4 words would echo through military history as one of the most defiant statements ever made by a surrounded commander. December 19th brought the first coordinated German assault on Bastogne's perimeter. The attack began at dawn, with a devastating artillery barrage that shook the ancient buildings of the town and sent civilians deeper into their cellars. The German 18th Volksgrenadier Division, supported by elements of the Panzerlehr Division, launched their assault from the southeast. Believing they had found the weakest point in the American defenses, they were wrong. The sector they attacked was held by the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuis. These paratroopers, veterans of Normandy and Holland, had spent the previous night digging foxholes in the frozen ground, their entrenching tools ringing against the iron-hard earth. When the German infantry emerged from the tree line, they met a wall of disciplined rifle fire that cut down the leading elements and forced the survivors to seek cover. The fighting was so close that tank crews could see the faces of their opponents through their vision ports. Sherman tanks, outgunned by the German Panthers and Tigers, relied on superior numbers and mobility to even the odds. the snow-covered fields became a maze of burning vehicles and fallen soldiers, as both sides fought with desperate courage. As referenced in the official records of the Third Army, preserved in the National Archives, the breakthrough at Hemrul came at 4:30 in the afternoon on December 26th. Lieutenant Charles Bogus of the 37th Tank Battalion, commanding the lead Sherman tank, made contact with paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division. The siege of Bastogne was officially broken. The relief of Bastogne marked the beginning of the end for the German offensive in the Ardennes. The failure to capture the vital crossroads had cost the Wehrmacht precious time and resources, while the successful defense had become a symbol of American determination and resilience. The Battle of the Bulge was far from over, but the tide had turned. The dawn of December 27, 1944, brought a sight that the defenders of Bastogne had dreamed of. For 11 days, American tanks rolling into the town square, their crews grinning and waving at the cheering paratroopers who emerged from their foxholes and defensive positions. The siege was over, but the Battle of the Bulge would continue for another 3 weeks as Allied forces fought to eliminate the German salient and restore the front line. The cost of holding Bastogne had been enormous. The 101st Airborne Division alone had suffered over 1,800 casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing. The 10th Armored Division and other supporting units had paid an equally heavy price. The streets of the town were littered with the debris of war-burned-out vehicles, collapsed buildings, and the countless small items that soldiers carry into battle and leave behind when they fall. Yet the strategic implications of the successful defense were immense. The German offensive, which had begun with such promise 11 days earlier, had lost its momentum. The delay in capturing Bastogne had allowed Allied forces to regroup and organize their counterattack. More importantly, the failure to take the town had demonstrated to the world that the German army, despite its initial success, was not invincible. The civilian population of Bastogne, which had endured the siege with remarkable courage, began to emerge from their cellars and basements. The town they found was drastically changed from the peaceful community they had known before the war. Nearly every building bore the scars of battle, and many families had lost their homes entirely. Yet the spirit of the people remained unbroken, and they began immediately to rebuild their lives. The relief of Bastogne also marked the beginning of a new phase in the relationship between American forces and the Belgian people. The shared experience of the siege created bonds of friendship and mutual respect that would last long after the war ended. Many of the American soldiers who fought in the defense of the town would return in later years as civilians, bringing their families to see the place where they had made their stand. The German forces that had surrounded Bastogne were now in full retreat, harassed by Allied aircraft and pursued by Patton's advancing armor. The withdrawal was costly and disorganized, with entire units becoming separated from their parent formations. The roads that had carried the German offensive forward now became paths of retreat, clogged with abandoned equipment and demoralized. Soldiers, Field Marshal model, recognizing that the offensive had failed, began planning for a defensive withdrawal to more favorable positions. The dream of reaching Antwerp and splitting the Allied forces in two had died in the snow-covered streets of Bastogne. The German High Command, which had gambled everything on the success of Operation Watch on the Rhine, now faced the prospect of fighting a purely defensive war with dwindling resources. The international press, which had been largely unaware of the siege while it was taking place, now began to report on the heroic defense of Bastogne. The story of General McAuliffe's defiant nuts response to the German surrender demand captured the imagination of the American public and became a symbol of the nation's determination to fight on regardless of the odds. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945, when the last German forces were pushed back to their starting positions. The campaign had cost the Wehrmacht over 100,000 casualties and had consumed the last reserves of men and equipment that might have been used to defend the German homeland. The path to Berlin was now open, and the end of the war in Europe was clearly in sight. The defenders of Bastogne were eventually awarded numerous decorations for their courage and sacrifice. The 101st Airborne Division received a Presidential Unit Citation, the highest honor that can be bestowed on a military unit. Individual soldiers received Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and Purple Hearts in recognition of their service. General McAuliffe was promoted to Major General and continued to serve with distinction until his retirement. The town of Bastogne itself became a symbol of Allied determination and sacrifice. Memorials were erected to honor the fallen, and the town became a destination for veterans, historians, and tourists from around the world. The basement of the Heinz Barracks, where McAuliffe had established his command post, was preserved as a museum, and the foxholes where paratroopers had fought and died were marked with monuments. The legacy of Bastogne extends far beyond the immediate military victory. The successful defense of the town demonstrated that free people, when called upon to defend their principles, can overcome seemingly impossible odds. The courage shown by both American soldiers and Belgian civilians during those dark December days became an inspiration for future generations facing their own challenges, as referenced in the comprehensive study The Battle of the Bulge by Hugh Cole. Part of the official U.S. Army history series, the Siege of Bastogne represented more than just a tactical victory. It was a testament to the power of human courage and determination when faced with overwhelming adversity. The men who held the line in those frozen foxholes had not only saved a small Belgian town, they had helped preserve the freedom of the world. Today, more than 80 years after the siege ended, the name Bastogne still evokes memories of valor and sacrifice. The town stands as a permanent reminder that in the darkest hours of human conflict, ordinary people can rise to extraordinary heights of courage and make choices that echo through history. The Battle of the Bulge may have been Hitler's last gamble, but Bastogne became America's finest hour. The airdrops were not without risk. German anti-aircraft batteries, positioned around the town's perimeter, opened fire on the slow-moving transport planes. Several aircraft were hit, and some crews paid the ultimate price for their courage. But the majority of the supplies reached their intended targets. Scattered across the snow-covered fields and streets of Bastogne in bright-colored parachutes that looked like flowers blooming in the winter landscape, among the supplies dropped that morning were bundles of Christmas mail from home, letters from wives, mothers, and sweethearts, many written weeks earlier, finally reached the soldiers who had wondered if they would ever see another Christmas. The psychological impact of these messages from home was immeasurable. Soldiers who had been fighting on empty stomachs and dwindling hope suddenly felt connected to the world beyond the siege lines. The German forces, recognizing that the supply drops threatened their strategy of starving the Americans into submission, launched their most determined assault yet. The attack began at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with elements of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, supported by Tiger tanks advancing from the northwest. The objective was to capture the town center and split the American defenses in two. The assault was met by the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Howard Johnson. These paratroopers, many of whom had not eaten a hot meal in for days, fought with the desperation of men who knew that retreat meant death. The battle raged from house to house, room to room, with neither side giving quarter. Private Robert Bowen of the 501st found himself defending a small stone chapel that had become a key strong point in the American defensive line. Armed with a Thompson submachine gun and 3 magazines of ammunition, Bowen held off repeated German attacks throughout the afternoon. When his ammunition ran low, he began throwing hand grenades from the chapel's bell tower, each explosion echoing through the narrow streets like thunder. The fighting was particularly intense around the town square, where American and German forces battled for control of the main intersection. The medieval buildings that surrounded the square, their thick stone walls pockmarked by bullet holes and shrapnel scars, provided cover for both sides. The battle seesawed back and forth, with buildings changing hands multiple times during the course of the afternoon. As evening approached, the German assault began to lose momentum. The attackers, suffering heavy casualties and hampered by the extreme cold, were unable to maintain their offensive spirit. The American defenders, though exhausted and depleted, had held every critical position. The town remained an American Hands and the German hopes of a quick victory were dashed once again that evening. As snow began to fall again, something extraordinary happened in the foxholes and defensive positions around Bastogne. Despite the proximity of enemy forces and the constant threat of sniper fire, American soldiers began to sing Christmas carols. The sound of Silent Night and White Christmas drifted across the frozen battlefield, a reminder of the humanity that persisted even in the midst of the most inhuman circumstances. The German soldiers, many of whom were homesick young men far from their families, could hear the singing from their own positions. Some, according to post-war accounts, began to sing their own Christmas songs in response. For a brief moment, the war seemed to pause as both sides remembered what they were fighting for: not just territory or ideology, but the hope of returning home to their loved ones. The medical situation in Bastogne remained critical despite the airdrops. The makeshift hospitals, established in the basements of damaged buildings, were overwhelmed with casualties from both sides. American medics, working by candlelight and flashlight, treated German prisoners with the same care they gave their own wounded. The International Red Cross, though unable to reach the town directly, had managed to get medical supplies included in the airdrops. As referenced in the official history compiled by the U.S. Army Center of Military History, Christmas Eve 1944 marked the psychological turning point of the siege. The successful resupply mission had demonstrated that the defenders were not forgotten, and the failure of the German Christmas Eve assault had shown that the town could be held. The stage was now set for the final phase of the battle. Christmas morning would bring new challenges, but also new hope. As word spread through the American lines that General George Patton's Third Army was fighting its way north toward Bastogne, the race to relieve the siege was about to begin. General George Smith Patton Jr. stood in the war room of his Third Army headquarters in Luxembourg City, studying the maps spread across the conference table with the intensity of a chess master, planning his next move. The date was December 23rd, and the flamboyant American commander had just received direct orders from General Omar Bradley to abandon his planned offensive in the Saar region and turn his entire army 90 degrees north to relieve the besieged garrison at Bastogne. The task seemed impossible to many of Patton's staff officers. The Third Army, consisting of over 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles, was spread across a front of nearly 100 miles to disengage from contact with the enemy, turn north, and attack through difficult terrain in the middle of winter violated every principle of military logistics and planning. Most commanders would have asked for weeks to prepare such a maneuver. Patton asked for 72 hours. The general's confidence was not mere bravado. His Third Army had earned a reputation as the most mobile and aggressive force in the European theater, capable of rapid movement and lightning attacks that left enemy commanders reeling. From the breakout at Saint-Lô to the pursuit across France, Patton's forces had consistently outmaneuvered and outfought their opponents. Now they faced their greatest challenge. The movement north began immediately. The 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, led the advance with orders to punch through German lines and reach Bastogne at all costs. Behind them came the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions, their soldiers loaded onto trucks and half-tracks. For the desperate race against time, the roads quickly became clogged with military traffic moving in a seemingly endless stream. Toward the sound of the guns, the German High Command, monitoring American radio traffic and troop movements, quickly realized the magnitude of the threat developing on their southern flank. The success of Operation Watch on the Rhine depended on maintaining the momentum of their advance toward Antwerp. If Patton's forces could break through to Bastogne and then continue north, they might cut off the entire German offensive and trap hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht troops in a pocket from which there would be no escape. Field Marshal Walther, Model, commanding Army Group B, faced an agonizing decision. Should he continue the advance toward Antwerp and risk having his forces cut off, or should he redeploy troops to meet Patton's threat? The delay in capturing Bastogne had already disrupted the German timetable, and now the entire operation hung in the balance. The weather continued to favor the American forces. The clear skies that had enabled the resupply of Bastogne also allowed Allied fighter bombers to attack German positions and supply lines throughout the Ardennes. The 9th Air Force, flying from bases in France and Belgium, launched hundreds of sorties against German armored columns and supply convoys. The Luftwaffe, hampered by fuel shortages and the loss of experienced pilots, could mount only token resistance. Inside Bastogne, the defenders could hear the distant rumble of artillery fire, growing closer each day. Radio communications, still sporadic due to German jamming, occasionally brought news of Patton's advance. The knowledge that relief was coming provided a tremendous boost to morale, but also brought its own dangers. Soldiers who had been fighting with the desperation of the doomed now had to maintain their vigilance while hoping for rescue. The German forces surrounding Bastogne, aware that their window of opportunity was closing, launched a series of desperate attacks designed to capture the town before Patton's forces could arrive. The assault on December 25th began before dawn, with the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division attacking from the east, while elements of the Panzer Lehr Division struck from the south. The coordination was better than in previous attacks, and the German forces came closer to breaking through than ever before. The critical moment came when German tanks penetrated the American defensive perimeter near the village of Hemrul, just southeast of Bastogne. The breakthrough threatened to split the American forces in two and open a path to the town center. The situation was saved by a hastily organized counterattack, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division. Abrams, whose name would later grace the main battle tank of the U.S. Army, had been leading the spearhead of Patton's relief force. When he received word that German armor had penetrated the Bastogne perimeter, he immediately ordered his Sherman tanks to attack. The battle that followed was one of the most intense tank engagements of the entire war, with American and German armor fighting at point-blank range in the narrow streets of Hemrul. The German assault was not limited to infantry. Supporting the attack were several Mark IV Panzers and the dreaded Panther tanks, their thick armor gleaming dully in the weak winter sunlight. The Americans had precious few anti-tank weapons, some bazookas, a handful of anti-tank guns, and the determination of men who refused to yield. What they lacked in equipment, they made up for in ingenuity and courage. Private First Class James Hendricks of the 502nd found himself alone in a foxhole when a German Panther tank approached his position, armed only with a bazooka and 2 rounds of ammunition. Hendricks waited until the massive tank was within 50 yards before firing. His first shot bounced harmlessly off the tank's sloped armor, but his second round struck the tank's track, immobilizing the 45-ton monster. German infantry, using the tank for cover, suddenly found themselves exposed to American fire. The battle raged throughout the morning, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Germans possessed superior numbers and equipment, but the Americans held the advantage of prepared positions and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Every building, every intersection, every patch of ground had been carefully studied and incorporated into the defense plan. As the day wore on, the weather became an increasingly important factor. The temperature continued to drop, and the snow began falling more heavily. German soldiers, many of whom lacked adequate winter clothing, found themselves fighting not only the Americans, but also the brutal Belgian winter. Frostbite casualties mounted on both sides, but the Americans, better supplied with winter equipment, suffered less than their opponents. The civilian population of Bastogne, caught in the crossfire, displayed remarkable courage and resilience. Despite the constant danger from artillery fire and street fighting, many remained in their homes, caring for wounded soldiers regardless of their nationality. The local Catholic Church, its medieval stones scarred by shrapnel, became an impromptu aid station where American medics worked alongside Belgian doctors to save lives. Food began to emerge as a critical issue for the defenders. The rapid German advance had cut off normal supply lines, and the stocks of rations carried by individual soldiers were quickly depleted. Foraging parties, moving under cover of darkness, searched abandoned buildings for anything edible. The irony was not lost on the paratroopers that they, who had lived on K rations and hardtack for months, now found themselves grateful for a handful of Belgian potatoes or a piece of stale bread. Communication with the outside world remained virtually impossible. Radio signals were jammed by German interference, and the few messengers who attempted to break through the encirclement either returned with news of impassable enemy positions or simply vanished into the snow-covered landscape. The defenders of Bastogne were truly alone, sustained only by their faith in each other and their determination to hold the line. According to documentation preserved in the Eisenhower Presidential Library, the situation reports from other sectors of the Ardennes offensive painted an increasingly desperate picture. German forces had advanced further than anyone thought possible, and the entire Allied position in Western Europe seemed to hang in the balance. The stand at Bastogne, though unknown to most of the world, was becoming crucial to the outcome of the war. As night fell on December 19th, both sides prepared for the longer struggle that lay ahead. The German commanders, frustrated by their inability to take the town quickly, began planning for a more systematic siege. The American defenders, counting their ammunition and rationing their food, settled in for what they knew would be a fight to the finish. The morning of December 22nd dawned clear and bitterly cold, with temperatures reaching 15 degrees below zero. The snow had stopped falling, but the accumulation now reached nearly 2 feet in depth, creating a pristine white landscape that contrasted sharply with the black smoke rising from burning buildings in Bastogne. It was on this morning that the German command made their most famous mistake of the entire siege. At approximately 11:30 in the morning, four German officers approached the American lines under a flag of truce. They carried with them a formal ultimatum, typed in both German and English, demanding the immediate surrender of the American forces in Bastogne. The document, bearing the signature of General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, was both pompous and threatening in its tone. The German emissaries were met by Major Alvin Jones of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, who blindfolded them and escorted them to a farmhouse where they could present their demands. The ultimatum read in part, to the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne: "The fortune of war is changing. This time the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. There is only one possibility: to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town." The message continued with thinly veiled threats about the fate of the civilian population and a 2-hour deadline for response. The German officers, confident in their numerical superiority and the hopelessness of the American position, expected a quick capitulation. They had grossly underestimated the character of the men they were facing. When the ultimatum was delivered to General McAuliffe at his command post, he was in the middle of reading intelligence reports about German troop movements around the perimeter. His initial reaction was a single word that would echo through military history: nuts. His staff officers, thinking he was preparing a formal response, asked what he wanted to tell the Germans. McAuliffe's reply was characteristically direct. That first remark of mine stands. The actual written response, delivered by Colonel Joseph Harper, was equally terse to the German commander: nuts, the American commander. When the German officers asked for clarification of the meaning, Harper reportedly told them, in plain English, "It means go to hell. And I will tell you something else if you continue to attack. We will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city." The rejection of the surrender demand sent shockwaves through the German command structure. General von Luttwitz, who had been confident of a quick victory, now faced the prospect of a prolonged siege that would tie down forces needed for the continued advance toward Antwerp. The German High Command, already concerned about the delays in their offensive timetable, began to question whether Bastogne was worth the resources being devoted to its capture. The American response also had a profound psychological impact on the defenders themselves. Word of McAuliffe's defiant reply spread quickly through the foxholes and defensive positions surrounding the town. Soldiers who had been wondering if rescue was possible now found renewed determination to hold their ground. The knowledge that their commander had rejected surrender in such colorful terms became a source of pride and motivation. the civilian population of Bastogne, many of whom had lived through the German occupation earlier in the war, understood the implications of the ultimatum and its rejection. They had seen what happened to towns that resisted German demands, and they knew that their fate was now inextricably linked to that of the American defenders. Rather than creating panic, this knowledge seemed to strengthen their resolve to support the soldiers who were fighting for their freedom. The weather continued to play a crucial role in the battle. The clear skies that followed the snowstorm should have allowed the German Luftwaffe to provide air support for their ground forces, but fuel shortages and the destruction of many airfields had severely limited German air capability. The Americans, meanwhile, still could not count on air support due to the distance from their bases and the limited range of their fighter aircraft. As referenced in military historian John Toland's comprehensive study Battle, the story of the Bulge, the rejection of the surrender demand, marked a turning point in the siege. The German forces, who had hoped to avoid a costly urban battle, now had no choice but to attempt to take Bastogne by force. The stage was set for some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war. The 2-hour deadline passed without further communication from the American defenders. German artillery batteries, which had been relatively quiet during the truce negotiations, resumed their bombardment with renewed intensity. The battle for Bastogne was about to enter its most desperate phase. Christmas Eve, 1944, brought no peace on earth to the beleaguered defenders of Bastogne. The dawn sky was crystal clear, and for the first time in days, the men in the foxholes could see the breath of their comrades in the bitter air. The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees below zero, making it almost impossible to operate weapons without suffering frostbite. Yet this brutal weather would prove to be the salvation of the encircled American forces. The clear skies meant that Allied aircraft could finally provide support to the surrounded garrison. At 8:30 in the morning, the first flight of C-47 Dakota transport planes appeared over Bastogne, their engines music to the ears of the defenders below. The aircraft, flying from bases in England and France, carried desperately needed supplies, ammunition, medical supplies, and most importantly, food for the starving soldiers.